I'm so grateful to see you here, and we're very excited and privileged to have with us Randall Balmer, who is an Episcopal priest, professor at Dartmouth College, author of 18 books, which is 18 more than I've ever written, and author most recently of Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right, a short and pithy biography of history of the evangelical movement, and kind of timely in light of Roe v. Wade and the other Supreme Court decisions that are coming down that are deeply influenced by the religious right. He's here working on a biography of Mark Hatfield. Some of you may remember Mark Hatfield with
everybody
affection. I remember when Mark Hatfield came to Reed College when I was a student in like 1977, and he gave a beautiful talk, and I was prepared to not like him, and I ended up really liking him a lot. I thought he was a decent person. He seemed very decent to me. Anyway, we're delighted to have you, Randall Balmer, with us. Tell us what you know, because we're anxious to learn. Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to see all of you. Thank you very much. How long do I have?
Till 9:45.
9:45. Oh, wow. Okay. All right. I'm here to talk about a stunning new book called Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right.
Which are on sale, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, I brought some with me in my suitcase. I don't want to take them back. So please. November 1990, I was invited to Washington, D.C. for a gathering. And to be honest, I was kind of busy at the time. I had a young family, and I was teaching at that time. I was an assistant professor at Columbia University, where I ended up teaching for 27 years before I came to Dartmouth 10 years ago. And I was undecided at the last moment whether or not I was really going to go to this meeting because I had other things in mind. But I decided finally at the last minute to do that. Went to Washington, found myself in a hotel conference room about this size. And it turned out it was populated with the leaders of the religious right. Ralph Reed was there. Ed Dobson, who was one of Jerry Falwell's lieutenants at Moral Majority, was there. Richard Land from the Southern Baptist Convention was there. Donald Wildman, who had founded the American Family Association, was there. Carl F.H. Henry, the founding editor of Christianity Today magazine, and Paul Weyrich, who is really the architect of the religious right, a longtime conservative activist. So here I find myself in this room, not sure why I was there. Turned out it was a gathering to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of Ronald Reagan's election to the presidency. Well, I hadn't celebrated 10 years earlier, and I wasn't inclined to celebrate then in November of 1990, but here I was. I thought, well, I'll make the best of this. In the course of the first session, Paul Weyrich, who I said is the architect of the movement, stood up and said, let's remember this movement, meaning the religious right, did not get going in response to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. Not at all, he said. We organized instead to defend racial segregation in evangelical institutions, including, of course, Bob Jones University, but also multiple segregation academies, whites-only segregation academies. And he was quite emphatic about this. And at the break, immediately after that session, I went up to him and I said, I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Abortion had nothing to do with the genesis of this movement. And he said, absolutely not. He said, I've been trying since the Goldwater campaign in 1964 to get these people, meaning evangelicals, interested in politics. He said, I tried everything. I tried abortion. I tried the women's rights movement. I tried the school prayer issue. I tried the pornography issue. Nothing got their attention until the IRS began going after the tax-exempt status of these evangelical institutions. Well, that conversation got me started on a long quest, far too long, really, kind of diverting me from other projects, but it resonated with me immediately because I had spent the 1970s very much immersed in what I've come to call the evangelical subculture in America. which is this vast and interlocking network of congregations, denominations, Bible schools, seminaries, Bible camps, publishing houses, missionary societies that had really been constructed in the 1920s and 1930s by evangelicals who were at that time retreating from the larger society. The evangelical subculture was constructed in order to protect them, and particularly their children, from the corruptions of the larger culture. And I grew up within that world. This is my background. And in the 1970s, I was thoroughly embedded, as they say these days, in that evangelical subculture. I was a student at Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois, from 1972 to 1976. And then I did a master's degree at the Divinity School, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, in the last years of the 1970s before heading off to graduate school in 1980. The point being is that Wyrick's representation resonated with me because abortion simply was not a matter of conversation in my evangelical world in the 1970s. So I began to try to figure out what exactly happened. And what I determined is that the distorting narrative is what I've come to call the abortion myth. The abortion myth is the fiction that the religious right galvanized as a political movement in response to Roe v. Wade in 1973. When in fact, 1968, Christianity Today, the flagship magazine of evangelicalism, together with another evangelical organization called the Christian Medical Society, convened a conference to talk about the morality of contraception and abortion. 23 heavyweight theologians from the evangelical world gathered over several days. And at the conclusion of their gathering, they issued a statement, which I will read in part. Whether the performance of an induced abortion is sinful, we are not agreed. But about the necessity of it and permissibility for it under certain circumstances, we are in accord. The statement went on to cite, quote, individual health, family welfare, and social responsibility as possible justifications for abortion, and allowed for instances of when fetal life, quote, may have to be abandoned to maintain full and secure family life. 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, not exactly known as a redoubt of liberalism, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion, which they reaffirmed in 1974, the year after Roe v. Wade, and again in 1976. When the Roe v. Wade ruling was handed down, several evangelicals actually praised the movement, the ruling, including one of the most famous fundamentalists of the 20th century, W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. Even James Dobson, you know James Dobson, said that the Bible was silent on the matter, and that therefore it was plausible for an evangelical to believe that, quote, a developing embryo or fetus was not regarded as a full human being. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February 26, 1978. That's more than 5 years after Roe v. Wade. So that raises the issue, once we've established the abortion myth, what really happened? Turns out the catalyst was indeed a court decision, but it wasn't a Supreme Court decision. It was a decision by the District Court for the District of Columbia, handed down on June 30th, 1971 in a case called Green v. Connolly. Now, the background for Green v. Connolly goes all the way back to the Brown decision of May 17th, 1954, but also to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What happened was that in Holmes County, Mississippi, the first year of desegregation, the number of white students in the public school system dropped from over 700 to 28. Wow. The second year of desegregation in Holmes County, Mississippi, that number dropped to 0. At the same time, 3 segregation academies, whites only, church sponsored, applied to the Internal Revenue Service for tax exempt status. And a group of parents in Holmes County, Mississippi said, wait a minute, this isn't right. So they filed suit. I don't have time to go into the whole legal history of that particular suit, but it was joined with another suit, came up through the court system to the district court for the District of Columbia, which ruled on June 30th, 1971, that any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable institution. And therefore, it no longer has any claims on tax exempt status. Do you think that got the attention of Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy begun in 1967 in Lynchburg, Virginia? Yes, it did. And it got the attention of other evangelical leaders. And they began fighting against they organized to fight against the Internal Revenue Service and the rescission of their tax exempt status. That is how the religious right got started. It had nothing to do with abortion, nothing whatsoever to do with abortion. Evangelicals considered abortion a Catholic issue throughout the 1970s. Well, how did abortion become part of the agenda? What happened really was by accident. Paul Weyrich, again, who's a very savvy guy, because sometimes I call him an evil genius, a very savvy political operative, recognized that if he was going to organize a grassroots movement of evangelicals, he needed an issue other than a defense of racial segregation. And I should say here, let me go back for a moment. I should have set this up earlier. But during the middle decades of the 20th century, roughly from the Scopes trial of 1925 to Jimmy Carter's campaign for the presidency in 1975-76, evangelicals were not active politically. Many were not even registered to vote. They were certainly not organized politically. Now, you had a few fringe characters who were out there making noise and so forth, but overwhelmingly, evangelicals were not organized politically. So Paul Weyrich's big task, beginning back in the Goldwater campaign, as I said, in 1964, was to organize this mass movement because he recognized what a huge movement it was and how it had all sorts of possibilities for changing the American political landscape. It turned out to be correct about that. But he also, as I said earlier, recognized that he needed an issue other than a defense of racial segregation. And so he begins two very clever moves. First of all, his move was to say, no, this is not a movement that is defending racial segregation. We're defending, and this will sound familiar, we're defending religious freedom. Brilliant. Brilliant, right? We're not defending racial segregation. We're defending religious freedom, allowing our institutions to run themselves as they please, conveniently failing to acknowledge that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. We all know that. I mean, I can make that case if you want me to, but you understand that, right? Trinity Cathedral does not pay property taxes to the city of Portland, right? And I'm not saying they should. I think there are very good reasons for this historically. But that means the neighbors have to pony up a little bit more. You all have to pony up a little bit more to pay for fire protection, police protection, parks, and so forth. I'm not getting into contemporary Portland politics right now, so I'll steer clear of that. Right? Tax exemption is a form of public subsidy, and therefore it is fully understandable that the government should want to have certain standards for the granting of tax exempt status. And that's exactly what was happening in the 1970s. But Paul Weyrich really, he was a cagey guy. I have to hand it to him. He quickly shifted the terms of the debate to a defense of religious freedom, thereby writing one of the pages from the contemporary playbook for the religious right. Second, he wanted another issue, and he really stumbled on the issue. What happened was in advance of the midterm elections in 1978, Weyrich went to the head of the Republican National Committee. At that time, it was Bill Brock, a former senator from Tennessee. And he asked for money to organize evangelical voters. And according to Weyrich, Brock looked across the desk at Weyrich and said, "What are you, crazy? Who are these people? I'm not going to give you this money." And Weyrich then determined, again by his own account, to go out and elect some rather improbable people in the midterm elections of 1978. He focused on 4 Senate races: New Hampshire, Iowa, and then 2 Senate races in Minnesota. One of them was for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale, who was Carter's vice president. And in the final weekend of that campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, leafleted church parking lots. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 favored Democratic nominees lost to anti-abortion Republicans. I remember reading through Paul Weyrich's papers, which are, of all places, the University of Wyoming in Laramie. And looking at his correspondence surrounding that midterm election in 1978, it's almost like the paper started to sizzle, because he realized he had an issue that would work for him for mobilizing grassroots evangelicals on a global basis, on a widespread basis. 3 months later, a film series starts to circulate around the country, particularly among evangelical audiences. And it was produced by a man named Frank Schaeffer, and it featured his father, Francis Schaeffer, in many ways the intellectual godfather of the religious right, together with a pediatric surgeon from Philadelphia named C. Everett Koop. No. And this series of 6 films was called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And it advances the thesis that any society that countenances abortion will very quickly also sanction infanticide and euthanasia. And I've actually tried looking through these films. They're just impossibly slow-paced by today's standards, and it's very difficult to get through them. But one of the most gripping images, and it's anybody who's seen the film will remember it, I expect, was C. Everett Koop standing on a rock in the Dead Sea out in Israel. And there are baby dolls, naked baby dolls kind of floating all over the place. And he's making the case against abortion. But even so, Frank, who's become a good friend, Frank Schaeffer, the producer, insists that even as they began touring the country, those first 3 months of 1979, the audiences were tepid, not particularly large, not particularly enthusiastic or responsive. So even then, the abortion issue wasn't fully kicking in among evangelical voters. And even as late as August 22nd, 1980, during the 1980 presidential campaign, this is when Ronald Reagan went to Dallas, Texas, before a group of between 10 and 20,000 screaming evangelicals. The numbers, the estimates vary. This is where he famously said, "I know this group can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing," brought down the House and arguably sealed the evangelical vote for the 1980 presidential election. I was reading through Reagan's speech out at the Presidential Library in Simi Valley. And in that speech, he talked about creationism. He lambasted Jimmy Carter and his regulatory agenda for the IRS going after the tax exemptions of these institutions. He didn't mention abortion even once, as late as August 22nd, 1980. Shortly thereafter, I came across shortly after that event, I came across a memorandum, a campaign memorandum for the Reagan-Bush campaign saying, "We're getting crushed in this election. We're not going to be able to win this election." And the recommendation at that time was to start talking about abortion. And so abortion finally begins to kick in as an evangelical issue in the weeks prior to the 1980 presidential election. So this is what I call the abortion myth. The abortion myth of evangelical activism in response to the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. Well, where does that leave us? Why is that important? one of the things I argue in the book is that unrepented racism, I think, has a tendency to fester. And unless you address it, it's not going to go away. And in the course of the book, actually writing the book, I actually was trying to make a connection between the abortion myth and the real origins of the religious right and the 2016 campaign when 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump for president. And I think there's a connection. And I think the connection is racism, to be honest. And by the way, I think the intermediate step, frankly, is Ronald Reagan. I look more closely into Reagan's political career. And many of you probably knew this, and I guess I kind of dimly recognized it at the time. But Ronald Reagan got into politics in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act in California, which sought to guarantee equal access to housing, both rental housing as well as purchasing housing. He was an outspoken opponent of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his political campaigns, he frequently invoked the racially charged phrase law and order. And anyone of a certain age can certainly not forget his vile caricature of so-called welfare queens, women of color, supposedly living lives of luxury off the public dole. He was never able to produce one of these welfare queens, but he was sure they existed. And for me, aside from his persistent support for the apartheid regime in South Africa and his decimation of the Civil Rights Commission as president, the central event, I think, took place on August 3rd, 1980, when Ronald Reagan chose to open his general election campaign for the presidency in, of all places, in the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi. A place where 16 summers earlier, members of the Ku Klux Klan, in collusion with the local sheriff's department, abducted, tortured, and murdered 3 civil rights workers, 2 Jews, and an African American. Reagan, of course, was the master of symbolism. But lest anyone miss his meaning on that occasion, August 3rd, 1980, he invoked the age-old segregationist battle cry, "I believe in states' rights." So I think part of the way to understand Donald Trump and his ability to win the allegiance of 81% of white evangelicals. Let's remember, this is not a family values candidate, right? All these years, the religious right has told us we're all about family values, right? But I think one of the reasons he was able to do that was his appeal to racism. I think I'm going to leave it there and invite questions. Is that all right? Okay, that was very quick. Thank you. Any, please. Yes.
Thank you so much for that, by the way. What recognition do we have in present day of those words? And I think it was the year 1968, where the permissibility of abortion was addressed by, you'll have to forgive me, this went rather quickly, with Southern Baptists who said it was.
The first statement was 1968, Christianity Today and Christian Medical Society.
Thank you. So what statements do we have today reconciling current morality or theological beliefs about sin or impermissibility of abortion with those words that were uttered 50, 60 years ago?
Not much.
Not much.
It's this is a durable myth. And I think part of it, the reason is that leaders of the religious right, particularly Falwell and Pat Robertson, and let's remember they had media empires behind them. They were able, I think, by sheer dint of repetition to kind of instill this sense that this has been a long time, long-standing concern on the part of evangelicals. It's just not. I mean, there is not. And you can go, they claim to derive all of their theological authority from the Bible. Well, you're pretty hard pressed to make that case. There are a couple of passages that they kind of shoehorn into that position, but it's a pretty difficult case to make. I think it's starting to sink in, and I think, frankly, I'm going to take a little credit for that myself. By the way, this book in 2014, Politico asked me to write a piece on the origins of the religious right. So I did. And at one time they told me it was the most popular thing they've ever published. I'm sure that's no longer the case, but at that point. And the reason I wrote this book actually was because I kept getting inquiries about this, 8-10 years later. And I decided to expand the argument with stuff that I found after I wrote that article, but also provide footnotes and substantiation so anybody could really get it for themselves. So I think the extent to which this book is getting circulation is starting to seep in. I've noticed in several op-eds in the Times, for example, that writers are simply saying, this is giving my narrative actually, rather than the typical Roe v. Wade catalyst. So I think it's starting to sink in. Now, whether or not the people who really need to understand this argument are appropriating it, I think is probably another question, but I don't have much control over that. Here, I believe, yes.
The other thing that was going on during that time that I remember very plainly is AIDS started
Yes.
in 1980, and also sort of the rise of sort of recognition of equality of gay and lesbian folks. So
Yeah.
a lot of that was sort of playing on that. And I can remember quite plainly that it wasn't that we were being discriminated against, but it was just sort of simply ignored, hoping that we would all die away or something.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think that narrative has to be included into the larger narrative. Anita Bryant saved the children campaign in Florida in 1977 and so forth. But even Anita Bryant, and I have a quote from her in the book, she said, yeah, people are interested in that, in this issue, but the real issue is the tax exemption issue. So even Anita Bryant recognized that was the real issue. Yes, please.
It's been fascinating. At the same time, you have talking about the religious right,
Yeah.
and you are, I guess, identifying that as a period from basically the 1960s to the present. Is that correct?
I would say late 70s, yes.
Okay, and yet the right for economic issues, which
Yep.
tax exemption is
Sure.
an economic issue. The 1950s, when the John Welch Society or the John Birch Society
Yep.
and Welch was making a pretty solid movement in the United States, and particularly important, particularly amongst the
Yep,
business
that's right.
community. Do you connect those at all in terms of the power of the religious right?
Yeah, the question was to what, I'm paraphrasing it, to what extent was Robert Welch and the John Birch Society a kind of a precursor to the religious right? I think there's some evidence for that. Actually, one of the main influences of the John Birch Society is on the Mormons. Ezra Taft Benson was very much a Bircher, and so there was a lot more direct and kind of identifiable evidence there. But yes, going back to the religious right, it was the anti-communist stuff, and certainly Billy Graham was, one of the main spokesmen on the anti-communist front. So he would have had some overlap with the sentiments of the John Birch Society. He was not a member until I know.
But what interested me in studying the 50s and the early 60s, in terms of that issue, many of the strong, powerful individuals on the right neglected, or rather badmouthed, the anti-communist conspiracy stuff.
Yeah.
And simply took on the economic issue.
Right. Yeah.
Which Reagan also did, particularly in 1988.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons for Goldwater's defeat, is that he was seen as too extreme on those issues. Yeah. This gentleman here in the first here, then I'll come back to you.
Hey, thank you very much for the talk. Having attended Berlin, a Baptist school right across town from Montgomery.
Oh, yeah.
All this makes perfect sense.
All
I can say is amen.
I've lectured there.
I would ask you to sort of think about a different issue, especially since you're an Episcopal priest,
Yeah.
and you have talked about the way that racism festers. Do you have any comments about that, particularly in the church right now at this moment?
Yeah.
since you are here in Oregon,
Yeah.
which has such a troubled history,
Yeah.
and Portland, which has such a troubled history, do you have any observations there that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think racism it's a cancer, and it has to be excised in some way. And I think there are different ways of doing that, obviously, and that's probably another conversation. But unless it is addressed directly and forthrightly, I think as I said, it continues to fester. And there's been really no acknowledgement from the leaders of the religious right that racism is an issue. Now, a couple of years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention did apologize for its origins, essentially, because the Southern Baptist Convention came into being in 1845 because they wanted to defend slavery. But there's a lot. It shows up in all sorts of ways, I think, and it's pernicious, and in some ways that people don't immediately recognize, even in themselves. I'm sure I have, some feelings. I'm not terribly aware of that, but I'm sure there's something inside of me that needs to be addressed on that issue as well. But more globally, I think it does need to be handled. Otherwise, it's not going to go away. I mean, it's striking to me that no evangelicals, at least evangelical leaders, marched with Martin Luther King from Selma to Montgomery. Right? Joshua Heschel was there. Other religious leaders were there, but no evangelicals were there. And Jerry Falwell's most famous sermon of ministers and marches. And I think I'm the first historian to make this connection. He actually preached that sermon. This is where he says, evangelicals, Christians should not be involved in politics. He actually preached that sermon Sunday evening, March 21st, 1965. That is the beginning of the march from Selma to Montgomery.
Wow.
This gentleman, then I'll come back.
I'm curious about the connection and communication possibly between the religious right and Catholic Church. I
Yeah.
think I heard you say that pamphleteering
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
done by their ACT.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. The question is between the connection between the religious right and the Catholic Church. Yeah, sometimes the phrase that they use themselves is co-belligerents. That is to say, they are allied in the same issues, even though historically, again, when I was growing up, in fact, my parents told me I would be disowned if I ever married a Catholic, that sort of thing. There's been historical animosity between those two camps, but they certainly have sought to work together on the abortion issue. And I think the conservative Catholics have become arguably more conservative. I mean, I write op-eds fairly frequently. I did a piece in the LA Times a year ago, I guess, something like that, asking in what moral universe does Joe Biden deserve a reprimand from Catholic bishops while they praise Donald Trump? I just don't quite understand that.
And they have the majority of the Supreme Court now.
I'm sorry?
Catholics are in the majority of the Supreme Court.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a whole other question. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, just my quick take on that is, the last several Republican presidents, and really beginning with Ronald Reagan, but certainly including George W. Bush and Donald Trump, owed their elections to the religious right. So that was their biggest political debt. And so when it came time to discharge that debt, you would think that they would appoint evangelicals to the Supreme Court. But the problem is there's no bench of evangelical. No, I mean, it's a description really. There's no bench of evangelical jurists. I mean, they're trying now to develop a kind of tradition. So what they've done in fact is subcontract their ideology to conservative Catholics. So that's where we are now. That's another whole question. Yes, please.
Are your books for sale today, and how much is it?
My books are for sale. I think they're about $15. Does that sound right? Does that sound fair? Yeah. I mean, I'm not, that's just.
A question from Zoom, if I may. I would like to be able to see the front of the book held up to the camera without it moving, so I can actually see the cover of the book.
How's that?
One moment, please. Just keep holding.
Why do
I
I
had to
feel
get
like
the
Vanna
speaker
White?
view so I could actually see it.
Okay. How's that? All right?
That's good.
Excellent, thank you.
Yes, please.
Just maybe beyond the scope of your writing, but I am going to read. I'm hesitant to wax too personal, but very quickly, I was adopted from Taiwan as and raised in an LDS family.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Attended Brigham Young University.
Yeah.
I'm an attorney, practicing lawyer. I consider myself to be post-Mormon.
Yeah.
I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
I'm hesitant to express this is very appropriate, but I'm very moved by your book. And we're distancing, and I didn't have had a chance to come forward afterward. But I just want to thank you for your scholarship. I'm moved. As with my profile, it's something as a Christian that I worked in my life. Joanna Brooks out of the University of San Diego. So
Yep.
Church. I'm concerned that I have children, a younger generation who identify Christians and Christianity with racism, with sexism. It's heartbreaking to me personally to see the lack of participation in religious expression, almost a stigma and a concern that if you are involved as a Christian, that you're automatically intolerant, that you're automatically. And I think all of us see this generational shift and this concern. I know this may be beyond your research, but in your musings, as you think about this, what advice would you have for those of us who are trying to instill faith, who are trying to minister, who are trying to build Christian beliefs and principles, but are fighting an uphill battle because of this heritage that has been sort of swept under the rug that you were so adequately and beautifully bringing to light?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and you know, I'll just start with a general observation. You know, my field, what I teach is religion in North America, and I've long argued that the most challenging task for parents of faith is to pass that faith to the next generation, and that's not, you know, merely in a contemporary context, as you were talking about, but historically, going back to the Puritans. I don't have time to give them the story, but the Puritans, this founding generation of the Puritans, simply could not pass the faith to the second generation, and it caused this huge existential crisis in Puritanism. That's not the only example, but if you want to look for another example of that in literature, read Chaim Potak's novel, The Chosen. Beautiful story about a Hasidic Rebbe who desperately wants to pass the mantle of leadership onto his very gifted son. And the son can't conjure the requisite piety. It's a poignant, really wonderful book. I recommend that. I think it's a great question, and I remember hearing David Brooks recently. He's talked about the importance of Christian formation, and that is awfully important. I think one of the reasons that mainline Protestantism is flailing these days, and I don't want to be too critical here because this is my tradition now as well, is that when the financial crises began hitting in the 1960s, one of the first things to go was campus chaplaincies. And I think that's, you know, looking back, that was a mistake. Now, that was not the only thing that was going on. It's very difficult. I guess my general response to that very good question is to go back to the words of Jesus. I have this thing, people talk about the Christian right. I find that term deeply offensive.
Yeah.
What's Christian about it? Somebody tell me what's Christian about it.
Amen.
Right? Go back to the words of Jesus and you'll find a very, very different agenda from what is being propagated by the religious right these days. But also, and I get into this a little bit in the early chapters of this book, is for evangelicals looking back on their own tradition. What people don't realize about evangelicalism is that in the 19th and even into the early 20th century, evangelicals would line up on what would be considered the left part of the spectrum in terms of prison reform, support for public education, known as common schools in the 19th century, Even the temperance movement requires a longer conversation, but that's can be seen as a liberal cause in the 19th century. Peace crusades and women's equality. Women's equality. I mean, that was a big part of that. So I guess my general advice would be go back to the words of Jesus. You can't beat that, right? That's a good place to start. But also look at what I consider the noble heritage of 19th century religious activism, trying to recast society according to the norms of godliness. And that's really quite inspiring story. I try to tell a little bit of that story now. I think please, yes. I'll go, I'm a cheap date. I'll stay.
Could you say something about, maybe this is way off topic, but could you say something about the Christian rights effort to make America a fundamentalist Christian?
Yeah, okay. Say something about the Christian, I will say religious rights.
Religious.
Efforts to, well, you're talking about Christian nationalism.
Yes.
Yeah,
Christian
yeah,
rights.
that's really pernicious. And that I will recommend another book. A very slim book I wrote called Solemn Reverence, Church and State in American Life. And first of all, utterly destroying this myth that America was and always is and always was a Christian nation. That's just nonsense. I think the First Amendment is a national treasure. I think the First Amendment is America's best idea because it separated church and state. Despite what you're hearing these days from the religious right, these are two separate entities. And religion has flourished precisely because it has been separated from the state. We have a vibrant, salubrious religious culture in this country precisely because of the First Amendment, not despite it. Also, you have to look at the Treaty of Tripoli, ratified unanimously by the US Senate in 1797. One of the phrases, Article 9 says, the United States is not in any sense a Christian nation. It's just nonsense, but it is a very, very powerful ideology. And I don't know if we're ever going to recover, but if we do, it's going to take decades to recover from these recent Supreme Court decisions. Not merely Roe v. Wade, but the Kennedy decision up in Washington and the Maine decision, disastrous decisions as far as I'm concerned. And I mean that disastrous, not only in the sense of our political economy, but disastrous for the faith. The whole image of the separation of church and state comes from Roger Williams, who is the founder of the Baptist tradition in America. And he wanted to separate the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. What people miss about that metaphor is that Roger Williams and his contemporaries were not members of the Sierra Club. That is to say, wilderness for them was a place of darkness where evil lurked. So when he wants to protect the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, he's talking about guarding the integrity of the faith from too close an association with the state. I don't have time, but if you invite me back sometime, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I will be back because I'm doing research for the biography of Mark Hatfield. But if we have time sometime, I will tell you about being an expert witness in the Alabama 10 Commandments case. I guess well, thank you so much for your time.